What's up, I'm Monto Tech, and here we have the Retroid Pocket Mini. It's a retro handheld by Retroid, the makers of the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, the Retroid Pocket 5, which is kind of taking the internet by storm right now. This is sort of the little brother to the Retroid Pocket 5. It has the same processor in it, so it gets similar performance, but it has this very unique 4:3 aspect ratio screen. It's an OLED display, so the colors really just pop off this display. It also has this seamless glass surface, so the screen sort of just melds into the front, minus these bezels that really just stand out. And this small handheld has some pretty serious performance too. You're gonna be running Gamecube at 2x resolution, PS2 at 3x resolution, and 3DS and PSP at 4x resolution. This thing is a powerhouse for its size. That being said, it comes in at $200 right now, so it's a lot to ask for such a small device. It has a lot of premium features to it, while it also has some aspects that kind of make it feel more like a toy. I'm kind of going on a tangent here. So I want to start this review off with a question. Who is this device for? And I think as we go through my experience with this, some testing that I did on it, some gameplay performance, we'll find the answer to that question together. So in this video, we're gonna do a deep dive into everything Retroid Pocket Mini. We're gonna cover a lot of ground, so settle in and let's get into it. I made a first impressions video about 2 weeks ago when I received this device. So I want to start off with how my impressions have either stayed the same from that video or have changed. Looking at the build of the Retroid Pocket Mini, the glass front is so premium feeling. That has not changed at all. This thing constantly feels very premium to hold, especially when your thumbs are against it. And I just love how the display is so seamless with the body. It's such a cool effect that there's no screen bezel on the outside. There's no like black border around the display. It's all so seamless. The body is nice, but it feels like they have committed to this ergonomic shape. The back grips aren't prominent to really give you much to hold on to, especially if you have larger hands. Usually you're gonna be holding the device like this. So these back grips are really just like giving you one finger worth of grip. You can see a PSP here. See how it kind of has like a very thick chocolate bar shape? I wish it was flatter like that or the PS Vita, or it was more prominent, kind of like the RG556. The RG556 is a much bigger device, but look at how prominent these grips are, and that gives you all your fingers worth of grip. Unrealistic to expect that from such a small handheld, but I wish these were just a little bit more or a lot less. Looking at the display here, this is a beautiful AMOLED display. I've really come to appreciate the quality of this thing. It's very high resolution for the size. While it is basically a 720p display with some extra room on the top and bottom, it looks very crisp because it's a 3.7-inch screen. The saturation, the contrast, and the fidelity really just come together to make a very premium experience when it comes to experiencing these retro games on a newer console. Playing these older consoles like PS2, GameCube, Wii on such a premium screen, especially upscaling those games, makes it a very enhanced experience, and you'll really only get that kind of experience on an OLED screen. It becomes a new way of experiencing these older games. A lot of them actually feel like they're remasters when you do upscale them and play them on such a beautiful OLED screen. That being said, these giant white bezels on this display really stand out, and they're very big and obvious when looking at this handheld. They're probably less obvious on the black model of the Retroid Pocket Mini, but on every other color, you're really gonna notice these bezels. And it doesn't necessarily take away from the gaming experience, but it does make you more aware of how small this screen is. If the screen was 4 inches and sort of filled out these bezels, it would make a huge difference to the immersiveness of this handheld device. Next, I want to talk about the buttons on this handheld. This has been one of the biggest pain points of my experience with the Retroid Pocket Mini. First, let's take a look at how tall these ones are. I did a side-by-side comparison in the first impressions video, comparing these to the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. These face buttons, they not only sit extremely high on this device, they're loud, they're clicky, they have a lot of friction, and they don't go down all the way. All of this comes together to making an extremely unpleasant experience for me personally, playing basically any game on this, especially ones where you're pressing a lot of different buttons rapidly. My thumb is already feeling that friction from just that 5 seconds of mashing buttons. Now imagine this playing any sort of beat 'em up game, fighting games, anything where you're gonna be doing a lot of button hits. This really adds up to making your thumb uncomfortable. The face buttons are by far the worst part of this handheld. The buttons have been my biggest op over the past 2 weeks. If I were to rate these buttons out of 10, I'd give them a 3, maybe a 2. Either way, stinky buttons I don't like. On the other hand, the triggers and the bumpers are not too bad. The Mini has good triggers. They're kind of hard to press down on sometimes because the back grips aren't prominent enough, so I don't really get a solid counter grip. You know, when you're pressing on triggers, especially when you have standard console controllers like an Xbox or PS5 controller, you have a lot of grip back there to easily counter grip when you're pressing down on the triggers. With these ones, you don't have that much on the back. So it kind of forces your hand into the front, which might cover the speaker, or it forces your back into it. It's just it's a very odd balance to press these triggers. You see how my thumb is just right in the way of that speaker right there? The bumpers are kind of loud and they're very clicky. This is something that I noticed in the first impressions video. That hasn't really changed. They haven't gotten any less loud. They're not my favorite bumpers, but again, they get the job done. Looking at the D-pad, this D-pad is great. I think it's very exceptional. It's the same sort of D-pad that they used on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, but a little bit better. It's sort of like a plastic version of the PS Vita D-pad. It has a very similar design structure where each one is a button. It's a lot clickier than the PS Vita. It's precise and I generally enjoy it. I don't like how these sticks are inline instead of offset where the analog stick is above the D-pad. I really wish that that D-pad was below the analog stick. I have to change my grip in order to use one or the other, and that's really not ideal. I think a big part of it is when it comes to PS5 controllers, PS4 controllers, the D-pad is more offset than the analog stick, so these are kind of more spread out, which makes it a lot easier to kind of rotate your thumb between them. And with that D-pad, I've noticed that my left thumb does hit the analog stick. Specifically, every time that I hit right or down, I kind of have to be very precise pressing certain directions. And again, this means that I kind of have to hold the device differently in order to use the D-pad. So that's not ideal for something that's supposed to be a little more ergonomic. Looking at the analog sticks, these analog sticks are great. I've really liked these thumbsticks, especially after putting caps on them. I have the caps here. I took them off for this review, but these are the kinds of caps that I like to put on all my handhelds. You can get them very cheap on Amazon. It's like 10, 15 bucks for 3 pairs of different sizes. Another thing that's pretty cool about these analog sticks is you can actually just pull them right off. There's an Etsy seller who actually 3D prints different shapes for these thumbsticks, and then you can just put them right back on. I have a couple coming in the mail, so we'll take a look at those together when those arrive. And that is a pretty cool part about these thumbsticks, is they're pretty versatile. You can put different caps on them, or you can change them out entirely. Now, looking at the range of motion, I think these ones are very, very premium. My thumbs kind of do rest a little high on them, so I do find myself kind of sliding around on them a little bit, which is why I like having those extra caps on the top. But from a technical standpoint, these sticks are really, really good. No dead zone, no cardinal snapping, just solid. There is a slight feeling of rubber on rubber when you're intensely pushing them forward, like especially when you're sprinting in games, pressing L3 and pushing it forward. It gets a little less comfortable, but that's due to the RGB rings around these analog sticks. And you can turn on those RGB rings by just tapping joystick light. And you can change the different colors. It's not a full RGB gamut, but you can find a color that you like. You can do less saturated, more saturated. But I usually keep the RGB rings off when I'm playing games. Now, taking a look at heat and comfort, the only time that I noticed the back and the top was getting hot was when I was playing Switch games and Fallout 3 on Winlator, which is a Windows emulator. Outside of that, I never noticed the device getting hot at all. It runs very, very cool, so it's very well designed in terms of heat management. And on the other side of the spectrum, the Odin 2 Mini runs very hot, so I kind of have an idea of where the heat points are on these devices. And this one is it just runs so cool. Taking a look at rumble, the rumble is pretty nice and subtle. It feels much closer to vibration than it does to traditional rumble. Imagine how phones vibrate. That's how this feels. It's kind of like more of a haptic feedback. That vibration type rumble is pretty common with a lot of these newer handhelds. One that has a very aggressive rumble would be the RG556. Let's just say it's a noticeable difference. Now let's talk about the battery life of this handheld. The battery life is very, very good for such a small device. I never think about the battery when I'm gaming. I played Hollow Knight for 3 hours and lost about 40% battery, so the efficiency of this device is really impressive. The Retroid Pocket Mini has a 4000 milliamp hour battery, and in my impressions video, I guessed it would get at least 3 hours of high-end gaming. This was more or less spot on, and after some extremely advanced, highly technical testing, here's what I found. Looking at 3 different scenarios. First, we have daily use. For this, we're running Wind Waker at 2x resolution in Dolphin emulator at 50% brightness with Wi-Fi enabled, so a pretty normal use case for a high performance handheld like this. And I was shocked to see that the Retroid Pocket Mini got 7 hours and 18 minutes of battery life, which lined up with my gameplay experience and how infrequently I'd need to charge this thing. Now, putting it into a much higher performance scenario of emulating Switch games, I tested Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen and Skyline Edge at 1x resolution and 100% brightness. I wanted to see in a more rare scenario where you'd be really just maxing everything out, how much battery life would you get? And even in this case, we're getting 3.5 hours of battery life. I think a lot of this efficiency comes from that newer Snapdragon processor. This thing is extremely efficient, and we're seeing that in the test results. Now, in the most extreme scenario, running the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme Stress Test, this is a benchmark that's designed to push devices to their limit. In high performance mode at 100% brightness, the result was a little bit shy of 3 hours, clocking in at 2 hours and 50 minutes. Again, this is a great result. Getting almost 3 hours of full throttle gameplay, it's kind of a luxury and not something you see very often, especially with smaller handhelds that have more powerful processors. Recharging this 4000 milliamp hour battery usually takes about an hour and 45 minutes using a USB-C power delivery cable, or with the included Retroid USB-A to C cable, it takes 5 hours and 40 minutes, charging at about 7 watts on average. Personally, I much rather prefer charging via USB-C. It takes significantly less time, but I know that there is an inherent risk of overcharging. But from my testing and monitoring a voltmeter, it seems like the voltage flow is pretty under control, and it really tapers off in the last 20% of charging. But looking at these numbers, this isn't a fast charge device. In most cases, the fastest you'll recharge from 0% to 100 will be about an hour and 45 minutes. Next, let's talk about these speakers. Overall, I'm not very impressed with the speaker quality. It's very mid-heavy and sounds like it has fake bass, and that really became more apparent as I spent more time with it. Here's what the speakers sound like compared to a device that I think has pretty great speakers, the Odin 2 Mini. Now, while they aren't the highest fidelity, they do have a great range. They get very loud and also pretty quiet. That being said, at their louder points, they do get a lot sharper. Let's take a look at that in a frequency response chart. So this graph here shows the frequency response of the Retroid Pocket Mini. The green line is the ambient noise of the room, so that's nothing being played, just the background noise. The blue line is the Retroid Pocket Mini playing white noise at 50% volume from 12 inches away. So you can get an idea for what frequencies really resonate in this device's speakers by looking at this chart. The first one that stands out is about 850 hertz. That kind of gives you that bassiness, but not quite low enough to really sound like bass. And then there's a pretty big spike at 4000 hertz. It's almost 15 decibels above any other frequency. So this is where it really stands out. This is sort of the lower high end or high mid range. A lot of the frequency of voice and dialogue sits around the 3500 to 4000 hertz range. But in my opinion, the imbalance of that high frequency is pretty extreme. And then there's a slight cavern at around 10,000 hertz, and then it shoots right back up at around 1200 hertz. And this gets into that kind of sharper high end. So this might be where some of the sharpness is coming from, but I really think it's more that 4000 hertz range that stands out. Now let's compare it to the Odin 2 Mini. This red line, it represents the Odin 2 Mini playing white noise at 50% volume from 12 inches away. You can see there's no narrow peaks. It's a lot more consistent and balanced than the Retroid Pocket Mini. The Odin 2 Mini has better range in the low mid range, so that 700 to 2000 hertz range is a lot more present than the Retroid Pocket Mini. It's about 5 decibels louder on average. Now let's zoom in to get a closer look. The range we'll look at is 500 hertz to 20 kilohertz. The next part that's different is the scoop down at 2000 hertz. Then instead of that narrow peak at 4000 hertz like the Retroid Pocket Mini, it has a much fuller high end, staying loud and present from 5000 hertz all the way until 10,000 hertz, and then it eases down through the far high end. Bringing it back to the Retroid Pocket Mini, this chart is a great way to visualize what frequencies these speakers tend to favor more. As we noticed in some of the speaker comparisons, that high mid-range, the 3000 to 5000 hertz range, is significantly sharper and louder on these Retroid Pocket Mini speakers, and the imbalance of that compared to all the other frequencies is pretty apparent. Quickly looking at some gaming benchmarks, I did 2 kinds of testing. The first benchmark I tested was the 3D Mark Wildlife 1-minute test, which is a very quick snapshot of how mobile gaming performance might look on this device. Looking at these numbers, this isn't a typo. Standard mode actually did score over 20 points higher than the high performance mode, and that's with the fan off in standard mode. So with no fan, we were scoring higher. I'm not sure how to attribute this delta, but this was consistent. I ran the test twice in standard mode and twice in high performance mode, and both standard tests were higher than the high performance ones. It's not by much, but it's interesting that high performance doesn't make that much of an impact. Now in the Wildlife Extreme 20-minute stress test, comparing performance mode to high performance mode, the high performance mode tested about 8 points higher, with a score of 1333 versus 1325. But what's more impactful than that 8-point improvement is the additional 1% battery loss that you get from the additional high performance mode with the max brightness. The 8-point score improvement, that's only about 0.5%. I'd probably just keep it on performance mode with a quiet fan preset. Let's move on into some gameplay, and we'll talk about each console and my experience playing it on the Retroid Pocket Mini. NES games are gonna look great on the Mini. This super crisp AMOLED display breathes new life into these older retro titles. And you can choose to do integer scaling for pixel perfect upscaling, but that would leave you with some empty space on the sides, so I like to just stretch it out to just fill the screen. This is kind of my preference with emulators across the board. I just kind of prefer full screen emulation, even if it does stretch the games out a little bit. The Mini passes the Yoshi's Island test with flying colors, both figuratively and literally. Another game that looks great, super colorful, and very sharp on this small display. This handheld really doesn't have any problems running retro titles, so SNES is basically plug and play in RetroArch. Another title that's great on the smaller handheld is F-Zero. You're gonna see me clutch it up here in the end, I like to make them think that they had a chance. Moving into 3D consoles, we have one of my favorite consoles, the N64. I've played a lot of Donkey Kong 64 on the Retroid Pocket Mini. We're playing it at 720p, and I'm not sure what that translates to in terms of resolution scale. But yeah, I had to scale it up a little bit more to fill the screen. As a side note, DK64 is a fever dream of a game. It's so convoluted. You have to like go back to old areas with your newer characters to like get all the collectibles and all that. And there's so many arbitrary mechanics in the game. There's like 7 different types of collectibles. It's one of those games that you go back to and you're like, how did anybody play this as a kid? But hindsight 2020, right? You know, the nostalgia goggles really cover up a lot. Moving into Dreamcast, here's Sonic Adventure 2. We're playing it in Flycast emulator. I completely forgot to upscale this when I was recording, so we're running this at 1x resolution. It already looks great, but I tested it at 2x resolution off camera, and that played extremely well. So you're gonna have no problems playing Dreamcast on here. I think it's something about upscaling home consoles that really makes the games look good. Sega Saturn games also run great on here. I haven't really played much Saturn in general. It was not really a console that I ever got too into. But here we have Panzer Dragoon Saga. We're running it at 1x resolution in RetroArch using Beetle Core. It is the most accurate core for Sega Saturn, but you give up the ability to upscale these games. They still look great. It's a small display, so you don't necessarily need to upscale these consoles, but that is the trade-off. If you want the most accurate emulation, then you have to use the Beetle Core in RetroArch. Dragon Force 2 is a game that I've heard some devices and emulators kind of struggle with. This one has absolutely no problem running it. I couldn't really figure out how to play this one, so gameplay-wise, it beats me. When it comes to PS1 games, we can upscale these to 3x resolution, which really looks pretty crisp on here. For some reason, Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped had some black bars on the top and bottom. They're very small, so it's not a big deal, but it's weird because I played Metal Gear Solid right after, and there wasn't any black bars in here. So I don't know. You could probably go into the per game settings to tweak some stuff, make it really fill out the screen. But by default, most of these PS1 games should fill out the 4:3 screen. Moving into PS2 games, we're going to start off with Shadow of the Colossus. This game struggles on pretty much any device that you try to run it on. I started running the game at 2x resolution, and I had to reduce that to 1.5x resolution. This game has a lot of motion blur, so pretty much any resolution that you play it at above 1x looks great. It's also one of those games that every time I test it, I never get past the first boss. Maybe I should look up a guide or something. Pretty much any other PS2 game will run at 2x resolution. And some games will even run at 4x resolution. Resident Evil 4 is one of those games, and it looks awesome. It's not as big of a jump as going from 1x resolution to 2x, but it's still a noticeable upgrade. And running this game at a consistent 30 FPS at 4x resolution is just a no-brainer. Gamecube is one of my favorite consoles to run on the Retroid Pocket Mini. Specifically, I've been playing a ton of Wind Waker on this handheld. Now, when it comes to Gamecube emulation, there's one setting that you should always keep an eye on depending on the game, and that's in your graphics settings, the video backend. Wind Waker was kind of stuttering at 2x resolution using OpenGL, so I switched it to Vulkan and got pretty consistent 30 FPS. And if you set your settings properly, pretty much any GameCube game should be able to run full speed at 2x resolution. Having a consistent frame rate is much more important to me than resolution, so I don't try to push it any further than 2x when it comes to GameCube. Mario Sunshine plays great at 2x resolution. There's a couple different flavors of the Dolphin emulator. I found that with Mario Sunshine, Dolphin MMJR2 had a slightly more consistent experience, except for any time you open up the map. Then the frame rate hitches, but it's only during the transition, and then it goes back to normal. It's very weird. Wii Games also scale great on here. We're also running these in the Dolphin emulator at 2x resolution. When it comes to performance, there's very occasional slowdowns in Monster Hunter Tri, but outside of those dips, it's a pretty fun experience. I think the bigger thing when it comes to Wii emulation is finding games that have the right control scheme. And if they involve any motion control, then finding ways to map those in a way that feels good when you're playing it. Donkey Kong Country Returns had this weird graphic glitch in both Vulkan and OpenGL backend, where the health bar, the puzzle pieces, and anything on the heads-up display isn't displayed. So it makes keeping track of health and lives and collectibles a bit tough. Another thing that was annoying about this game is that you have to make a separate controller profile with the horizontal Wiimote controls, and you also have to map shaking the Wiimote. I mapped it to the right analog stick. But yeah, I think that if that graphic overlay glitch wasn't content there, this would be a lot better experience. But I've heard that emulating the 3DS version is probably a little better. Now, speaking of 3DS, let's talk about some handheld consoles. We'll start with Game Boy Advance. Game Boy Advance looks really good on here, especially because a lot of these Game Boy Advance games were really colorful and played on a similar size handheld and similar screen. The 4:3 aspect ratio means that we kind of have to squish it in a little bit or play it with borders. And one thing to keep in mind when it comes to GBA is you can't really upscale these games. The original Game Boy Advance screen resolution was only 240 by 160, and you can't really add pixels to these 2D games, so you are stuck with the original resolution. But performance and control wise, these games are awesome. This is a great way to play Game Boy Advance games. Here's our first true widescreen console, and it's the PSP. PSP is a console that you can upscale to 4 times resolution, which gives you a very crisp 720p resolution. But all of these games are widescreen, so if you don't want to vertically stretch them, then you're stuck with a very tiny screen. The Retroid Pocket Mini has the performance to run these games at 4x resolution, but it's not the best way to play them. Looking at Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, this one is actually locked at 20 FPS natively, so it's a pretty framey and crunchy experience. This isn't a performance problem. This was a limitation of PSP games running on original hardware. Another thing to note about PSP is that it only had one analog stick, so a lot of these games use the D-pad for camera controls, and that's pretty clunky, especially when you can't double map buttons. So I can't map the D-pad to the D-pad and also to the analog stick. I have to pick one or the other. You could make a controller profile for certain games where you map the D-pad to the analog sticks, but that's a whole thing, and it was already a headache to do that in Dolphin for Donkey Kong Country Returns. And I think that PSP specifically combining widescreen with clunky controls and a limited frame rate, it's just not a great experience. You could also technically add cheats and mods to run this game at 60 FPS, but I did want to showcase the vanilla experience with just upscaling. Nintendo DS was surprisingly an amazing experience. I actually loved how DS games looked on the Mini. You can run these games at 4 times resolution, no problem. And when it comes to emulation, there's a few different ways you can play DS games. You could have both screens stacked. You could have one big screen with the other screen smaller. Or what I like to do is just have one screen fill up the display at a time, and then map the right trigger to switch screens. So with DS games and 3DS games, which we'll show next, the best games are the ones that primarily use one screen at a time. Remember, this is a 3.7-inch display, so if you want to do stacked displays or hybrid with one big and one small, then things could get a little too small. When it comes to 3DS games, you can upscale these to 3 times resolution on the Retroid Pocket Mini. And just like the regular DS, I like to have these games run full screen and then map the switch screen button to maybe L3 or one of the triggers. I tried scaling Animal Crossing to 4 times resolution because I thought that it would be one of the easier games to run, but at 4 times scale, it was a little choppy. So most 3DS games, you should stick to 3 times scale. It still looks really good when you're playing, but one thing that I couldn't figure out is that the top screen of the 3DS is a different resolution than the bottom screen. So I couldn't figure out how to scale it to fill the screen, especially being able to switch displays and changing resolutions and all that stuff. But like most of these consoles, especially at this price range, this screen is also touchscreen. It has a little microphone at the top left, so you can do all the gizmos that come with a lot of these DS and 3DS games. I did want to mention Wii U emulation. As of right now, the Retroid Pocket Mini doesn't have an Android 13 update yet. We're still stuck on Android 10, so we can't do any Wii U emulation. We need Android 13 to do that. Maybe when that comes out, we'll be able to run CEMU. I know that with the Retroid Pocket 5, you can run Wii U games on there pretty well. So for now, we kind of have to stick to either Wii or Switch games. Now, speaking of Switch games, the Retroid Pocket Mini fails the Dark Souls test. It crashes when you try to name your character, which you can't skip. I haven't tried loading a save from after character creation yet. Maybe the game itself runs and that's kind of like a way to bypass it, but I'm not entirely sure. I suspect that it might be a RAM problem because the Retroid Pocket Mini has only 6 GB of RAM, and Switch emulation is something that needs a little bit more RAM to run properly. But there's a good amount of other Switch games that actually do run great. We are running into the same problem as we did with the PSP, where you have to stretch these games out to fill the screen or play them in their native aspect ratio, but much smaller. And again, because we're running Android 10, we're pretty limited on what emulators we can even use. If you want to use turnip drivers for a little more performance, you have to get a specific Android 10 compatible turnip driver. So Switch emulation kind of gets a little bit technical. But if you can get these games to work, then they're pretty solid. I don't love the stretched out display, but from a performance standpoint, it's very capable. Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen played actually very well, and this is a relatively demanding game when it comes to emulation. It crashed once while I was in the first encampment, so I'm not sure if this is going to be a problem that we keep running into, and hopefully the game is fully playable. One game that I know isn't fully playable is Bayonetta 2. A YouTube commenter named Altern6181 commented on my testing 25 Switch games on the RG556 video, mentioned that Bayonetta 2 crashes on Chapter 3 in most emulators, but one of the workarounds is turning off the driver and then playing it with black screen and then picking back up at an autosave later. These are the things that you might have to do when it comes to Switch emulation. One huge benefit of the Retroid Pocket Mini having a Snapdragon processor in it means that we can run Windlater pretty well. So I played a few hours of Fallout 3 on here, and performance-wise, it runs very well, except for one strange glitch. One weird thing about Windlater and Snapdragon 865 processors is that the DX wrapper, the DirectX wrapper, when it's set to DXVK or VKD3D, which are both Vulkan-based DirectX wrappers, you get this weird CRT static fuzz kind of effect. It's a very specific bug that's known to be a problem with Snapdragon 865 processors in Windlater. It's a very specific bug that comes with these processors, but it doesn't happen on the Odin 2 Mini, which has a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor. So it only happens with the 865. Just make sure to run it with a wrapper that has VK in the name. It runs very poorly with WinD3D. If you can get past that, then playing Fallout 3 is a great experience on here. It scales perfectly to 4:3, and it runs at a very playable frame rate. Moving into game streaming, I don't think that you're going to want to game stream too much on the Retroid Pocket Mini. We're running No Man's Sky and Moonlight, and because we're streaming from my desktop PC, we're stuck in this 16:9 widescreen experience. We could stretch it out to fill the screen, but then it would look like the Switch games that I stretched out earlier. So it's not too optimal. Theoretically, you could change a bunch of settings, and Moonlight actually mentions how risky it is to change the resolution scale to natively match your display, and then you would have to go into the games that you're streaming and make those scale to 4:3. It's a whole thing where the risk isn't really worth the reward. I'd much rather just game stream on a different device. And in case you're wondering, the Retroid Pocket Mini passes the Sandworm Thread the Needle test. Native Android games are pretty great on the Mini. One game that I've been playing a ton of is the Android port for Hollow Knight. It doesn't natively support 4:3, so you can either run it in 16:9, which gives it those huge black bars at the top and bottom, or you can kind of zoom it in, which crops out the sides, so you won't be able to see a lot of entrances and stuff. You kind of have to guess. But I've put a ton of hours into the game like this, and it's pretty great. On the other hand, Minecraft does natively support 4:3, so that fills out the screen no problem. You can see everything, and the Retroid Pocket Mini has excellent performance. Having two great analog sticks on a device like this makes playing first-person games like Minecraft really enjoyable. Unfortunately, when it comes to Fortnite, I tried playing Lego Fortnite. This is a game that I put a lot of hours into. It's basically just Lego Valheim. For some reason, the Retroid Pocket Mini gets kicked out every single time I try to play it. It seems to either be a problem with Retroid's firmware being rooted, and Fortnite might be flagging this to their servers, or the Pocket Mini is so new that it doesn't recognize the device and it's like currently blacklisted or something. I don't know. This handheld clearly has the performance to run this game very well. It just sucks that we can't play this online game because of some weird software issue. A big question that I ask myself when I'm using these handhelds is how do I like it compared to my other devices? Comparing it to my Odin 2 Mini Pro, a device that is $400, which is twice the price of the Retroid Pocket Mini, is a little bit unfair, but that has been my daily driver, so let's talk about how it compares. Now that I'm finishing up this review, I'm gonna be returning back to this thing, at least until the Retroid Pocket 5 arrives. The Retroid Pocket Mini is just a little too crampy, and the 4:3 screen is just a little too limiting to justify the gaming experience. I'd rather have a far more versatile widescreen device at the cost of adding black borders on the sides when playing certain retro consoles. And the comfort and feel of the Odin 2 Mini is just superior to the Retroid Pocket Mini. The offset analog sticks, the buttons and triggers, they're just better. It is twice as much, but it's twice the experience. Comparing it to the Anbernic RG35XX SP, I think I'd still rather play Game Boy Advance games and Game Boy Color games on the SP. But anything with an analog stick is out of question for the SP. So while it is a bit limiting, it excels in what it's designed for. Looking at another Anbernic device, the RG556, and I'm putting the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro in this category as well. These devices kind of feel like benchwarmers to the Odin 2 Mini. And I think in a way that's where the Retroid Pocket Mini is going. It's not very versatile and the buttons are a huge turnoff, especially when the face buttons on every other handheld are so much better. The AMOLED display on the Retroid Mini is beautiful, but it's still beat by the RG556 screen. It's basically twice the size and it's one of the best screens I've seen on a sub $200 handheld. And when it's on sale, you can get it for like $160. The performance on the 556 is still not as good as the Mini, but it's a trade-off, and I've done a lot of testing specifically with Switch games on the RG556. You can check out one of those videos by clicking the card up here. So to bring it full circle, I want to go back to the question I asked in the intro. Who is this device for? If you're looking for a horizontal 4x3 device that's small but not tiny, with excellent GameCube and PS2 performance, and you're not scared of the $200 price tag, then the Retroid Pocket Mini might be the perfect handheld for you. I'd consider other features like the glass surface, OLED screen, the great thumbsticks and D-pad to be secondary to these factors. However, if you want to play any 16:9 games and you want a medium-sized device and you don't mind less performance, you're maybe interested in game streaming and might not want to spend $200, then I'd recommend something like the Anbernic RG556, the Retroid Pocket 4, or something that's maybe a quarter of the price like the Trim UI Smart Pro, which does come with a quarter of the performance. The Trim UI is going to be struggling on some PSP games. There are a lot of options, and this one stands out as a very specific option. Something that's a little more versatile and a little more expensive is the Retroid Pocket 5. So if this handheld feels a little too specific with the 4x3 screen and the small profile, maybe you'd want to look at the Retroid Pocket 5 instead. Now to wrap it up, let's go through my overall pros, mids, and cons with the Mini. This thing is an emulation beast. It can run virtually anything that you throw at it and then some. You can upscale PS2 to 3-4x resolution. Any GameCube and Wii game runs pretty great at 2x resolution. And basically every game before that runs perfectly. And these games not only run great, but they look great on this very crisp 960p OLED screen. These analog sticks are excellent. They're very high quality and they have a great range of motion. We also have a great D-pad on the Mini. It's tactile, responsive, and excellent, especially with precision platforming games. The speakers get very loud, so this is a small device with some pretty serious output. The battery life of this handheld is amazing. Over 7 hours of GameCube and PS2 emulation, and at least 3 hours of high-end emulation. And it stays very cool unless you're pushing it to its absolute limits. Looking at aspects that I didn't quite like or dislike, the 4x3 aspect ratio is definitely at the top of this list. It works great for games that are designed for 4x3 ratios or similar ones like 3x2 for Game Boy Advance, but anything that's widescreen or 16:9 looks extremely small on this 3.7-inch screen. And the speaker quality isn't necessarily a pro or a con, it's somewhere in the middle. It's not great, but it's not the worst thing ever. The ergonomics are another thing that's somewhere in the middle for the Mini. Some people might like the shape of this device, but I don't necessarily love it, nor do I hate it. It can get a little bit crampy sometimes, but other times I don't really think about it. And there's the size of the Mini. It's kind of like a PSP with some curves, if you know what I'm saying. It's both not big enough and not small enough for my preference. If the display filled out the device a little more, it would probably feel better in terms of its size. But the giant bezels on that screen kind of make it feel like you're looking through a window. For cons, the poor face buttons are the biggest standout. These ones really are not great. I've touched on them a lot through this review, but to sum it up, I wish that they weren't cylinder shaped. I wish that they had a little more comfort, a little more curve to them, and I wish that they went in a little further and didn't cause as much friction on my thumbs. The inline analog sticks are another thing that's more of a personal preference, but I also think that offset analog sticks are just more comfortable in general. This is when the D-pad is below the left thumbstick. Having these these inline analog sticks with the thumbstick below the D-pad makes playing analog stick-centric games a bit less comfortable. The buttons on this device also get very loud. This stood out to me, especially when I was playing games late at night. The buttons were significantly louder than I wanted them to be. This handheld also lacks versatility. With its 4x3 screens, smaller size, inline analog sticks, a lot of these things add up to where you can't really have a great experience playing more modern games, especially widescreen games. So game streaming is out of the question. Anything that's widescreen, you have to stretch vertically, so it's just not very versatile. I think in general, using a widescreen display and playing a retro console with black bars on the sides is a much better experience than playing widescreen games on a 4x3 console, where the black bars are on the top and bottom. Another thing that's weird is the system buttons placement. How the start and select are at the top right and top left, and the home and back button are on the bottom left and bottom right. It just leads to a lot of misinputs, and it kind of just felt like a weird decision for me personally. I wish that they stuck with more of the standard start and select on the right, home and back on the left. And then there's the software issues. The fact that this handheld is still on Android 10 is a huge disappointment. I'm really hoping that we can update the Mini to Android 13 soon so that we can really unlock more of the performance. But for now, it's kind of kept behind bars because we're stuck with this older operating system. So that's the Retroid Pocket Mini, a very premium toy-like handheld that is already being overshadowed by its big brother, the Retroid Pocket 5. I have mine coming in the mail within a week or two, so we'll take a look at that when it arrives. But anyway, thank you for watching this deep dive on the Retroid Pocket Mini. Leave a comment to let me know what you'd like to see in a future video, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.